I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Try to bring back a very specific memory from your childhood. Breathe in deeply. Can you smell the sweet, earthy aroma of red paprika slowly sizzling in a pan of melting pork fat? Can you hear the rhythmic, comforting ticking of the old mechanical clock on the kitchen wall, mingling with the faint, crackling sounds of the so-called radio in the background? Welcome back to the 1970s in Hungary. It was a time when the world felt entirely different. We did not have much. In fact, there were days, especially toward the end of the month, when we had absolutely no money at all. But if you grew up during this magical era, you know the beautiful truth. Our mothers and grandmothers possessed an incredible magic. They could walk into a pantry that looked completely bare, take a little flour, some potatoes, a spoonful of lard, and create an absolute feast that filled the entire house with warmth. Today we are going to remember 25 of those brilliantly cheap, humble meals that fed us when times were tough. These are the flavors of our youth, the taste that defined a generation. And I promise you, by the time we reach the final dish, your heart will feel just as full as your stomach used to be on a cold winter evening. Let us take this beautiful journey together. Before we walk into that retro kitchen, let us just pause and remember how time used to flow back then. It moved so much slower, did it not? There was no frantic rushing, no glowing screens demanding our constant attention. Life happened in the physical world. Yes, we had to stand in long lines at the local grocery store, but those lines were not a burden. They were our social network. We talked to our neighbors, we shared recipes, we complained about the weather, we laughed. Today, people might look back and think that because we lacked modern technology and wealth, we lived a poorer life. But that is the greatest myth of all. Our lives were infinitely richer in emotional connection and pure sincerity. The kitchen in our panel apartment or our little village house was the absolute center of the universe. It was where the homework was done, where the heavy secrets were whispered, and where the air was always thick with steam and love. When you do not have money to buy expensive ingredients, you have to invest something else into the food. You invest your time, your patience, and your soul. That is why a simple piece of bread tasted like heaven. We did not eat quickly while looking at a phone. We sat down together, we looked at each other across the formica table, and we shared what little we had. And in those moments we were the wealthiest people on earth. Now, let us remember those incredible dishes. Let us begin with the absolute king of our childhood snacks, the legendary bread with lard, or as we all knew it, gyros kenyér. Can you still feel the weight of that heavy 3-kilogram loaf of greyish bread? Our grandmothers would hold it against their chest and slice it with a large, slightly dull knife, cutting a piece so thick it felt like a meal in itself. Then came the enamel pot from the pantry, holding the pure, snow-white pork fat. It was spread generously, filling every little hole in the rough bread. But the true magic was in the decoration, a heavy dusting of sweet red paprika from Szeged or Kalocha, turning the white canvas into a vibrant crimson red, and finally the sharp, biting rings of fresh purple onion. When we played outside until the streetlights came on, this was the fuel that kept us going. The way the fat would slightly melt if it was a warm summer day, the crunch of the onion, the mild sting of the paprika. It was a masterpiece born out of necessity, a penny-pinching meal that tasted better than any luxury food today. It connected us to the earth, to the hard work of our families, and to the pure, unadulterated joy of simple sustenance. And then there was the classic potato pasta, or grenadiermars, as many families called it. This was the ultimate end-of-the-month saviour. The process itself was a comforting ritual, boiling those humble, cheap potatoes until they were soft and yielding. In another pan, onions were cooked down in fat until they turned translucent and sweet, followed by that essential spoonful of paprika that gave the whole dish its glowing sunset colour. Then the square pasta was tossed into this glorious, oily, starchy mixture. The trick, as any good Hungarian mother knew, was to let it catch just a little bit at the bottom of the pan, creating those crispy, slightly burnt edges that we all fought over. We would sit at the kitchen table, the windows steamed up from the cooking, and eat huge platefuls of it. It was always paired with a small bowl of calamade, that sharp, vinegary mixed cabbage and pepper pickle that cut through the heaviness of the starch perfectly. It cost almost nothing to make, relying only on pantry staples that lasted through the winter, yet it was hearty, filling and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the genius of peasant cooking that kept generations of us fed and happy. When the evening turned cold and the wind howled outside our windows, nothing provided more comfort than a warm bowl of semolina pudding, the beloved tejbegris. It was a dish that required immense patience. You had to stand by the stove, stirring the milk continuously with a wooden spoon so it would not scorch the bottom of the pot, slowly pouring in a thin stream of semolina until it thickened into a velvety, bubbling cloud. It was a true act of love from whoever was making it, and the best part was the topping. Since real high-quality chocolate was an expensive rarity, we used that cheap, slightly bitter, dark cocoa powder, heavily mixed with powdered sugar to make it sweet. We would sprinkle it over the hot pudding, watching the white steam melt the sugar into dark, glossy puddles. Some of us would carefully stir it until the whole bowl turned light brown, while others loved to eat it perfectly from the edges, keeping the stark contrast of white and dark intact. It was a cheap, filling supper that felt like an incredible dessert, soothing our childish worries and warming our bellies before we were tucked into our beds under heavy down comebacks. Let us take a moment to honour the incredibly brilliant potato stew, our famous paprikas krumpli. This was the dish that proved you did not need expensive cuts of meat to create a deep, robust flavour. The ritual began with peeling a mountain of potatoes, an activity where often the children were drafted to help, sitting on small stools with a peeler in hand. The base was the holy trinity of Hungarian cooking: pork fat, onions and paprika. The smell of that base cooking down is perhaps the most iconic scent of any 1970s household. If it was a good week, maybe a tiny, thin slice of cheap Lexo sausage was added just to give a hint of smokiness to the broth. The potatoes would slowly simmer in this rich, red liquid until they were soft enough to break apart with a fork, thickening the sauce with their natural starch. We always ate it with the freshest, softest white bread we could find. You would tear off a large chunk of the bread and use it to mop up every last drop of that thick, spicy, oily red gravy from the bottom of the deep plate. It was a meal that made you sweat just a little bit, filling you with energy and a profound sense of satisfaction. Sunday mornings had a very specific aroma, the rich, heavy smell of frying oil and savoury egg batter. This meant only one thing: we were having bundaskenyér. In English, they might call it French toast, but our version was strictly savoury and deeply practical. It was the absolute best way to rescue bread that had gone hard and stale over the week. You never threw bread away. That was an unspoken law. You sliced it, soaked it briefly in beaten eggs, and fried it in a pan of sizzling oil until the edges were crispy and golden brown, while the inside remained soft and steaming. We would stand by the stove, impatiently waiting for the first piece to cool down just enough so it would not burn our fingers. We usually ate it completely plain, or perhaps rubbed with a little clove of garlic if we were feeling adventurous. Beside it there was always a huge mug of hot, dark tea, sweetened with sugar and flavoured with those tiny plastic bottles of lemon juice substitute, because real lemons were a rare luxury. That combination of the oily, savoury bread and the hot, sweet tea is a memory that instantly transports us back to a lazy weekend morning in our childhood home. Speaking of mornings, we cannot forget the iconic breakfast ritual of chicory coffee and crescent rolls, the famous matikave and kifli. Real coffee beans were expensive and highly prized, often saved for guests or special occasions. For everyday mornings, and especially for the children, there was the substitute coffee. Do you remember the yellow tin with the drawing of the bear? It was not truly coffee, but a roasted cereal and chicory blend that provided a warm, dark, comforting brew. Mixed with warm milk and a good spoonful of sugar, it had a sweet, roasted flavour that we absolutely adored. And it was always accompanied by a water-based crescent roll, the classic vizes kifli. Those rolls were cheap, incredibly airy, and had a slightly chewy, salty crust. The absolute best way to eat them was to tear off the pointy end and dip it directly into the hot mati coffee. You had to time it perfectly. Too quick and the bread was still dry. Too long and it would break off and fall into the mug, turning into mush at the bottom. It was a simple, affordable start to the day that left a sweet taste in our mouths as we rushed off to school carrying our heavy leather briefcases. There was one soup that was the ultimate symbol of having completely empty kitchen cupboards, yet it is remembered with intense fondness: the toasted caraway seed soup, or rantot levesh. Some jokingly called it the blind soup because there was nothing swimming in it to see. When there were no vegetables, no meat, and no pasta, a mother could still make this beautiful, warming dish. It started with a simple roux, melting fat and slowly toasting flour in it until it achieved a deep, nutty brown colour. Then, caraway seeds were added, releasing a sharp, aromatic fragrance that filled the entire house. Cold water was poured in, vigorously whisked to prevent lumps, and it was brought to a slow simmer. To make it a bit more filling, stale bread was cubed and toasted in a dry pan to create rustic croutons. Pouring that hot, flavorful broth over the dry bread transformed it instantly. The bread soaked up the savory liquid, becoming soft and rich. It was a miracle of culinary survival. It cost mere pennies, but the toasted, earthy flavor of the caraway seeds provided a deep, comforting warmth that made you forget you were eating a meal born entirely out of poverty. Now, let us recall the joy of homemade langos. Today, we think of langos as an expensive treat bought at the beach at Lake Balaton, loaded with sour cream and mounds of grated cheese. But back in the 1970s, langos was a cheap, frequent weekday dinner made in our own small kitchens. When a mother made bread dough, she would pinch off a few pieces, stretch them out by hand into rough, uneven circles, and fry them in a deep pan of oil. The dough would puff up immediately, creating beautiful golden blisters on the surface. We did not have fancy toppings. We took a raw clove of garlic, peeled it, and rubbed it vigorously over the hot, crispy, oily surface of the fried dough. The heat of the langos would slightly cook the garlic, releasing its pungent oils. We ate it standing up, our fingers dripping with oil, burning our tongues because we could not wait for it to cool down. A little bit of salt on top was all it needed. It was incredibly filling, deeply satisfying, and completely reliant on the most basic, inexpensive ingredients. It was the ultimate comfort food that brought smiles to our faces after a long, exhausting day. One of the most divisive yet iconic dishes of our youth was the caramelized cabbage pasta, the legendary kapostash testa. Making this dish was a true labor of love and a lot of elbow grease. A large, cheap head of white cabbage had to be grated by hand, a task that often left scraped knuckles. It was heavily salted and left to sit so the water could be squeezed out. Then came the magical transformation. Sugar was melted in hot fat until it caramelized to a deep, dark amber color, and the dry cabbage was added to roast slowly until it turned a beautiful, rich brown. It took a long time, filling the kitchen with a complex, sweet and savory aroma. Mixed with flat, square pasta, it became a battleground at the dining table. Half the family insisted it must be eaten savoury, burying it under a mountain of freshly ground black pepper that made you sneeze. The other half swore it was a dessert, dusting it heavily with powdered sugar. Whichever side you were on, this meal was a staple of cheap living. It stretched a few pennies into a massive, heavy meal that sat warmly in your stomach for hours. When time was short and hunger was sharp, we often turned to a snack that was uniquely ours, a simple slice of buttered bread, completely transformed by a tube of piroshareni, the red-gold paprika paste. Do you remember the crinkled metal tube? It felt almost like a tube of toothpaste, but what it held was pure, concentrated Hungarian flavour. We would take a slice of bread, spread a thin layer of butter or margarine to create a base, and then carefully squeeze a bright, vibrant red line of the salty paprika paste across it. Some of us would draw patterns, while others just squeezed out a thick ribbon. The contrast was absolutely perfect. The soft, mild creaminess of the butter perfectly balanced the sharp, intensely salty and slightly spicy punch of the red gold. You could make it in 10 seconds, and it cost next to nothing. It was the snack we ate while watching the evening cartoon, the machilachi, on our black and white television sets. It was a brilliant piece of food engineering that gave a plain piece of bread a massive burst of flavour, proving once again that a lack of money did not mean a lack of taste in our homes. As the long, hot days of late summer rolled in, the fields around the towns and villages were high with corn, and that meant it was time for boiled corn on the cob, the beloved furt kukurica. This was not the sweet, delicate, perfectly uniform corn you find wrapped in plastic in supermarkets today. This was robust, hearty field corn, often bought by the sack for just a few coins from a local vendor, or sometimes quietly borrowed from the edge of a cooperative farm field. The large outer lees were laid at the bottom of a massive pot, the cob stacked on top, covered with more leaves, and boiled until the entire house smelled like sweet, earthy summer. We would take the steaming hot cobs, impaling the ends with special little forks or just holding them carefully with our bare fingers, and roll them heavily in coarse salt. The cheap butter, if we had any, would melt instantly, running down our chins and hands as we bit into the chewy, slightly tough, but incredibly flavourful kernels. We would sit on the porch or the balcony, gnawing the cobs completely clean, spitting out the occasional tough skin, completely happy and thoroughly entertained by this incredibly cheap communal feast. Another late summer miracle was lecture. When the markets were absolutely overflowing with yellow, pale green and slightly wrinkled peppers, the prices dropped so low you could buy them by the kilogram for almost nothing. That was when the giant pots came out. Making lecture was a family event, endless slicing of peppers and tomatoes, crying over huge piles of chopped onions. The onions were sweated in pork fat, sweet paprika was dusted over them, and then the tomatoes and peppers were stewed down until they collapsed into a rich, sweet and slightly acidic ragu. If there was no money for sausage, it was eaten entirely plain, or perhaps an egg was cracked into it at the very last minute to give it some extra substance. The true joy of lecture was the sauce. We would slice an entire loaf of fresh, crusty white bread and use every single piece to dip into the deep plates, soaking up the oily, tomato-flavoured juices. It was summer captured in a bowl, a frugal, brilliant way to utilise the seasonal abundance of the Hungarian soil, providing a hot, hearty meal for pennies. When the dark, freezing days of winter arrived and the snow piled high against the windows, our mothers had a secret weapon to warm the house and our spirits: roasted pumpkin, or sütötök. Buying a massive winter pumpkin cost hardly anything at the market. It was a tough, heavy vegetable with a thick grey or orange skin. It required a large, sharp knife and a strong hand to slice it into large crescent-shaped wedges. We would scoop out the seeds, which were sometimes washed and dried on the radiator for a salty snack later, and placed the giant slices directly into the hot oven. As the pumpkin roasted, an incredible transformation took place. The edges would caramelize and turn slightly black, while the natural sugars inside bubbled and thickened. The smell was absolutely intoxicating, a deep, sweet, honey-like aroma that drifted through every room of the apartment. We ate it hot, straight from the oven, using a spoon to scrape the sweet, soft orange flesh away from the tough skin. It was our winter dessert, completely natural, heavily nutritious, and wonderfully cheap. It was comfort food in its purest, most essential form. Let us talk about a dish that sounds incredibly dry and strange today, but was a staple of our childhood: the toasted semolina pasta, or darash testa. When there was literally nothing in the fridge, this was the absolute last resort, yet we loved it. You took dry semolina, the same stuff used for the milk pudding, and toasted it in a dry pan until it turned a pale, sandy brown. This required constant attention, as it could burn in a matter of seconds. Once toasted, a little water and oil were added to make it swell, and then it was mixed with whatever cheap boiled pasta was available. On its own, it was terribly dry and scratchy, but that is where the grandmother's pantry came to the rescue. A massive, generous spoonful of homemade apricot jam, the sargabarakleckvar, was dropped right in the middle of the hot pasta. We would vigorously mix it all together. The sweet, sticky jam bound the dry semolina to the pasta, creating a sweet, fruity, and delightfully textured meal. It was a masterclass in making something beautiful out of absolutely nothing, relying entirely on the preserves that were carefully put away during the summer. Another classic weekday lunch, especially in the school canteens and our own kitchens, was the tomato cabbage stew, paradichomos kaposta. It is a dish that divides generations, but for us, it was a warm, familiar presence. It was simply white cabbage, cooked down until very soft in a sweet and slightly sour tomato sauce, thickened with a heavy flour roux to make it dense and filling. It had a very distinct smell, a mixture of the earthy cooked cabbage and the sharp, bright scent of cooked tomatoes. It was incredibly cheap to produce in large quantities. We usually ate it with a simple piece of boiled potato on the side or a thick slice of bread to wipe the plate clean. If it was the beginning of the month, there might be a small meatball, a fasciette, sitting on top, but very often it was just the vegetable stew on its own. It was not fancy, it was not glamorous, but it was hot, sweet, and provided the calories we needed to run around the neighborhood all afternoon. It reminds us of a time when food was not judged by how it looked, but by how it sustained us. There was a sacred ritual in every Hungarian household that occurred usually on a Monday or Tuesday, and it was entirely focused on leftovers. We called it eating the pörkört saft, the stew gravy. On Sunday, if a family had a little money, they might make a proper pork or chicken stew, but by Monday, all the meat was completely gone. What remained in the bottom of the pot, however, was the most precious thing of all. A thick, dark red, congealed layer of onion and paprika gravy, rich with all the rendered fat and flavour of the meat. No one in their right mind would ever wash that pot without utilising the gravy first. We would take large, soft pieces of white bread and wipe the bottom and the sides of the cold metal pot until it was practically shining. That thick, savoury paste sticking to the bread was intensely flavourful, arguably better than the meat itself. It was a testament to the Hungarian principle that absolutely nothing goes to waste. Every single drop of fat and flavour was precious, and cleaning the pot with a piece of bread was considered a privilege, not a punishment. It was the taste of pure, concentrated Sunday memories on a bleak Monday afternoon. We must also remember the simple joy of turos chusa, the curd cheese pasta. While today it is often served alongside rich fish soups in restaurants, Back then it was a standalone, incredibly cheap main course. The base was a cheap local turo, our crumbly, slightly sour curd cheese. It was mixed with hot, freshly boiled pasta and generously dolloped with thick, sour cream. The beauty of this dish was in the temperature contrast, the steaming hot pasta melting the cold sour cream and softening the crumbly cheese. If the family had a tiny bit of extra money, they would fry up some small pieces of smoked bacon, pouring the crispy bits and the hot, salty rendered fat over the top of the white pasta. The sound of that hot fat sizzling as it hit the sour cream is a sound I will never forget. It was a heavy, dairy-rich meal that coated your stomach and made you feel instantly sleepy and content.
It relied on cheap, accessible dairy products that were staples of the socialist agricultural economy, turning them into a dish that felt incredibly luxurious and decadent. Now I want to talk about a treat that sounds absolutely bizarre to modern ears, but was a beloved secret indulgence for many of us. The sugar and lard bread, the chukros gyros kenyér. Imagine the situation. You are a child, you are craving something sweet, but there is no chocolate, no cookies, and no jam left in the pantry. What do? You take a slice of bread, spread a thin layer of savory pork fat on it, and then sprinkle it generously with granulated white sugar. It sounds like a mistake, a chaotic mixing of savory and sweet, but oh, the reality was entirely different. The mild, creamy texture of the fat acted as a perfect base, holding the crunchy, sweet crystals of sugar in place. When you bit into it, you got the savory richness of the lard, followed immediately by the sharp, crunchy sweetness of the sugar. It was a strange, beautiful compromise born out of sheer desperation and the relentless sweet tooth of childhood. It is a memory that makes us smile and shake our heads today, wondering how we ever loved it so much, yet secretly knowing exactly how good it tasted. Sometimes, the simplest things bring the most profound memories. Let us remember the humble water roll, the Vises Semle. In the 1970s, bakeries produced these incredibly light, airy, round bread rolls that had a thin, crackling crust and an inside that was mostly air. Buying them early in the morning, smelling the yeast and the warm flour from the local bakery was a daily ritual. We would take a semle, tear off the top like a little hat, and use our fingers to pull out the soft white crumb from the inside, often rolling it into little dough balls and eating them. Then, we would take a tiny sliver of butter, or if there was no butter, just a squirt of cheap yellow mustard, and spread it inside the hollowed-out crust. We would put the lid back on and eat the crispy shell. It was a snack of almost zero nutritional value, costing merely fillers, but the texture and the simple yeasty taste were deeply satisfying. It was the food of school recess, of quick breakfasts on the run, a symbol of a time when our needs were incredibly simple and easily met by a warm piece of baked dough. Finally, as the long, dark winter evenings drew to a close, there was one last wonderfully cheap treat that filled our homes with magic. Baked apples, the sult alma. When the cheap, slightly bruised autumn apples started to get soft and wrinkly in the cold pantry, they were not thrown away. Our mothers would carefully core them, taking out the seeds. If we were incredibly lucky, a small walnut or a spoonful of sugar mixed with a tiny pinch of precious cinnamon was stuffed into the center. Then, they were lined up in a baking dish and put into the hot oven. As they baked, they would collapse and burst, their skins wrinkling further, releasing a thick, syrupy juice that caramelized on the bottom of the pan. The scent of baking apples is the ultimate fragrance of a happy, safe home. We ate them hot, using a small spoon, being careful not to burn our mouths on the steaming, sweet puree inside. It was a gentle, soothing, and completely free dessert that calmed us down and prepared us for sleep. It was the perfect ending to a day where we had nothing, yet somehow we had absolutely everything we ever needed. As we look back at these 25 humble, inexpensive meals, a profound realization washes over us.
We are not just nostalgic for the taste of the red paprika, the dripping pork fat, or the burnt sugar. What we truly miss is the feeling of that era. We miss our youth, we miss the slow, deliberate pace of time, and most importantly, we miss the people who stood by those hot stoves. Our mothers and grandmothers who performed absolute miracles with empty wallets and hands full of love. The food was cheap, yes, but the devotion it took to make it was priceless. It reminds us that true wealth is not found in a bank account, but in the warmth of a shared kitchen and the echoes of laughter around a small dining table. If this journey back in time brought a smile to your face or a tear to your eye, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And now I want to ask you, which of these cheap, beautiful meals was your absolute favorite growing up? And who is the person that always cooked it perfectly for you? Please write your story down in the comments below so we can keep these precious memories alive together. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering with me.